What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and this is going to be another tournament report for the Yata tournament that just wrapped up the other day in the YGO from Zero Discord. Now, this tournament was the biggest Yata tournament I think we've had on record, with 36 players playing, which is, I think, the biggest that we've done since the original Yata format actually happened. And it was really exciting to host this tournament and see people really get involved in the format, as I think the format's really cool. I think this tournament really shows there's a lot of depth to be uncovered in it, and there's still a lot of room for experimentation. So let's just dive into the top cut results. I could go over the wheel here, but the wheel is pretty standard. Basically, the majority of the field brought hand control, which is kind of what people thought was the sort of tier 1 deck, or I guess tier 0 maybe, but after last form, people were kind of realizing that it wasn't really tier 0, but it's the deck that people thought was like the most dominant deck by far, and that's shown in the results here. People also brought a fair amount of Gearfried, which was the deck that won last tournament for this format, and there were a variety of other decks sort of having representation as well. But I want to focus on the topping decks, because the topping decks tell a very interesting story. Now, this was a Swiss tournament, so that meant that there was a top cut to top 8. But Format Library's breakdown actually includes the 9th deck as well. And I think that this is a really good inclusion, because the 9th deck is really neat. It's Ellie Tin Can on a Fiend deck, which is very, very interesting to see. But there are some very powerful Fiends in this format. Dark Ruler Hades is just really good at negating your opponent's effect monsters like tomatoes or Sangans or witches, and Lesser Fiend can do a very similar thing, banishing your opponent's monsters, which can be good into something like Fiber Jar, because your opponent will have less monsters to shuffle back, and can also be good at negating things like Sangan, Witch, and Tomato. They're also playing triple Gravekeepers Spy. I think this is a really good card for decks that want to go a bit more tribute focused, because, it fetches out another monster from deck, and also your opponent might have a tough time getting over a 2k defender. So I think that this deck is really, really sick, and I hope that people experiment more with Fiends in the future, because I think that this deck doing so well in this tournament, even if it didn't reach the top cut, is a really good showing for it. So I think that there's a lot of potential here. But that's the Fiend deck. The rest of the top 8 is actually very interesting as well. So there were 2 Gearfried decks, which, could be implied by the wheel here, given, it's the second most represented deck, so it makes sense that there are 2 people topping with it. But I think that this does go to show that its win last tournament was not a fluke. This deck is really powerful. The triple Gearfried plus Blast with Chain combo can be really good and really hard for opponents to deal with, especially given that a lot of people are playing a lot less beaters than they were in the past. So, it's less likely that your Gearfried will get beaten over by something like a Gemini Elf or a Bazoo. But we did see a fair amount of beaters in some of the other topping lists here. So, maybe that will change in the future, and Gearfried will be a bit less good if people go to a more beater-focused strategy. But for now, I think Gearfried is still very well positioned in the meta, and I think that it can still put forward great results like you see here. Now, there were a bunch of hand control decks in Top Cut. The one that I really want to talk about is actually the second place list by Jazz. So I think that this list is really interesting. It techs in a lot of cards that don't often see play in this format. I think that this deck topping shows that these cards should maybe be considered more in more decks in the future. Firstly, I want to talk about Bazoo. Bazoo is a very interesting card here, because it's very different from the formats that have come previously in the TCG. Previously, this card was sort of mistranslated, so that way it was ruled that you could banish any card from the graveyard for its effect, which made it a lot better in my opinion. In this format, you can only banish monsters off Bazoo, which makes it a little bit more limited. And also with things like Fiber Jar, if you lose too many monsters from your graveyard and then everything gets Fiber Jarred back, then you could be put at a major disadvantage in the future. But Jazz is using it here, I think, more as like a finisher. So basically, you search it off of Witch, and then you have a monster that can get over your opponent's Jinzos, can deal a lot of damage, etc. So I do think that this is a good inclusion here at 1, and I'm curious to see if more people adopt it in the future. Another card that people haven't really been playing with, but I think is really cool in this deck, is Newdoria. Newdoria is a level 4 Fiend monster with 1200 attack, and it's a dark, which means it can be fetched off of Mystic Tomato. Now, the cool thing about Newdoria is that once destroyed by battle, it actually pops an opponent's monster. So this means that if you are in like a tomato war and you're crashing Mystic Tomatoes, you can bring out a Newdoria and stop that from going through, or make your opponent's Mystic Tomatoes a lot less effective. And I think it's a really, really cool like target in this deck to bring out off the tomato, and it's replacing some other targets like Don Salug, which is actually not in this deck entirely. Which I think is a really interesting choice because a lot of Yata decks have been playing a core of like Don Zalugs with Reinforcing the Army and Mystic Tomatoes. Jazz cuts the Zalugs entirely, and I think that that was a heads-up decision, and it really paid off for him. So I'm curious to see if Zalug will see less play in the future outside of more warrior-focused decks. Another interesting thing to note here is that there are 2 Spirit Reapers in the deck, and that's different from normally people playing 1. But I do think that this is also a very good inclusion here. It can be fetched off of Mystic Tomato. It is also a hand rip, just like Zalug is, and also it's really annoying for your opponent to deal with. There aren't as many cards in this format that target, and if your opponent is using something like a Change of Heart or a Snatch Steal on this to get rid of it, or even like a Ring of Destruction, I think you're generally pretty happy with that trade. And if this card can also get, damage as well, then that's very, very good. So I think this is a really heads up inclusion, and I think that more decks will adopt playing more Spirit Reapers in the future. Now, the spells are pretty standard for this sort of list. I mean, just a lot of power spells in this format, and Jazz is playing pretty much all of them. But the traps are where this deck gets even more interesting, in my opinion. So first off, there's more chainable traps in this deck. Jar of Greed, Time Seal, and Raigeki Break are very notable here. Because people aren't really playing these cards. There are just so many powerful cards in this format that oftentimes these sort of get crowded out. But I do think they are pretty good. There is a fair amount of spell and trap removal in this format with things like Harpy's Feather Duster and Heavy Storm running around, although most people don't play heavy in the main deck. And so having these chainable back row can bait out things like Harpy's Feather Duster and also just get you some advantage. Also, Time Seal is one of the only cards that actually interacts with a Fiber Jar activation after Fiber Jar has been flipped up, because its effect will linger and prevent your opponent from drawing on the next turn. So I think that's a really nice inclusion here as well. And Jar of Greed can also get you out of the Yata lock too, which is pretty nice. And Raigeki Break can just be used to deal with very annoying cards, and it does pair well with the Sinister Serpent that is also in the deck here. One other thing to note is the Trap Hole in the main deck here. Trap Hole is kind of an interesting inclusion. So Trap Hole has been sort of in and out of playability since Android format. And Android format Torrential Tribute came out, and despite that, people generally opted for the Trap Holes as it managed to preserve your board presence, and in that format, having beaters on field was a lot more important than it would eventually become. So in that format, Trap Hole saw a lot of play, but after that, Trap Hole kind of fell out of favor. Things like Yata can dodge around Trap Hole, and it can't dodge around Torrential Tribute, so that made Torrential Tribute applicable in a couple more situations than Trap Hole was potentially. But I think with a deck like this, the Trap Hole makes sense. You don't necessarily want to TT a board when you've got something like Spirit Reaper set up, or something like Newdoria potentially as well. So I think the Trap Hole is a real heads-up play here. And I'm curious to see if this will sort of inspire more people to tech out Trap Hole in their decks in the future. There's also Trap Hole in the side deck as well to bring in against tough matchups. And I think in the finals match, we actually did see Jazz bring in double Trap Hole, I think. I could be wrong, but I think I recall seeing 2 Trap Holes in one game during game 2 or 3 during that finals match that we actually streamed on the channel the other day. So it can be a very valuable card against certain matchups. The rest of the side deck here is pretty straightforward, I think. There are some interesting techs here. I think Guardian Sphinx is very interesting. I'm not exactly sure what you'd side that against in, but it's still very, very cool here. Also, there's like a little bit of a goat control package and also some creature swap package. Also, Yata being in the side instead of the main is kind of interesting as well. But it does make sense as, it is a much better card going first than going second. And also, I mean, the Yata lock does take a fair amount of things to go right to actually set up. So it's not the guarantee that it will be in later formats. So I think that, just cutting down on a card that could otherwise be dead and maybe is a bit too win more could make a fair amount of sense. So I'm curious to see if more people will take this approach in the future. But, despite this being an awesome deck, it did wind up in second place. And, that's not to cast shade on the deck or the duels. Both are very good. But the topping list was very, very innovative, and I think really combated a lot of interesting elements in the metagame, and also was piloted by another very good duelist as well. And the finals match was very close. It really could have gone either way between the top two players. So, really, really cool to see a match like that. Definitely check it out if you haven't already. But without further ado, let's dive into the deck that really took this tournament by storm, which is Alfia2's Gravekeeper build. Now, this deck is really, really sick. So, Gravekeepers is an archetype that people have experimented with in the past, but generally, people haven't really been considering it for like tournament tier contention because it's kind of gimmicky. Its monsters are generally like not as cohesive as other archetypes eventually would be. Gravekeeper's Spy can fetch out another Gravekeeper from deck, and Alfia 2 is playing the two other best Gravekeepers here, which is Gravekeeper's Assailant and Gravekeeper's Spear Soldier. But ultimately, these cards do very different things, and so it's kind of interesting, but people haven't really seen it as being super, super competitive here. But this deck really changed people's minds. And I do think that it's partially because this deck just has a good matchup against a lot of other things in the metagame. Gravekeeper's Spear Soldier can deal with a Set Serpent, which is it's a way that people can sort of stall out for time when they don't have monsters, and a lot of decks are playing very low monster counts. So it makes sense that, Spear Soldier would see a fair amount of play. It also does stop things like Reaper from actually blocking your attacks as well, which is very good. Also, things like Spear Soldier and Assailant become 2k beaters under Necro Valley, which is very important. And Assailant can also beat over most beaters with Necro Valley on field because you can change them to defense, which is very, very useful as well. So I think that these cards are pretty, well positioned in this metagame as is. And Spy is also a card I think, seeing it being played in this tournament has gotten a lot of people to really consider this card a lot more for this format. 2k defense is really hard for a lot of decks to get over, and also fetching out another monster on top of that can be very nice, especially if paired with tribute monsters like we saw in Ellie Tin Can's Fiend deck. But here, Alfia 2 doesn't even need Fiend monsters or any tributes or anything like that. They're just using these for sort of fields forming potential and just the ability to get in for damage consistently. And I think that that is a really, really good sort of take on this deck, and it served them very well. The other monsters here are pretty standard. We got the triple Mystic Tomato fetching Dawn's Lug as well as Sangan and Witch of Black Forest, and also the Gravekeepers here as well. With Mystic Tomato, the Gravekeepers can actually win a sort of tomato war, which is very nice, and something that a lot of other decks can't really boast. So that's another advantage to playing this sort of package. The deck does cut some notable monsters, though, which is worth mentioning. So, for instance, there's no Fiber Jar here. Fiber Jar doesn't really play well with Necro Valley, as Necro Valley can negate it if there are actually cards in the graveyard. You've also got no Serpent here, which is kind of interesting. But I mean, I guess the deck doesn't really need it. Same with Lily. So I think this is really sick. Also, the Morphing Jar here is a pretty interesting inclusion. It can draw you deeper into your deck, potentially draw you into things like Necro Valley, which, this deck is playing 2 of. It buffs up your monsters to 2k beaters in a lot of cases, and also does stop a lot of graveyard effects, things like Monster Reborn, Call of the Haunted, or even Premature Burial if people are playing that. So I do think it's a very good inclusion here. There are some other interesting spells as well. For instance, a Book of Moon here is very nice, especially on a Gravekeeper's Spy. You flip down your Spy, flip it up, get out another monster. But also can be used on things like your opponent's beaters. You flip down one of those, attack over it with a Spear Soldier, and you've gotten in for some damage as well. So that can be very, very nice. Also, there is a main deck Nobleman of Crossout, which pairs well with the book as well. So there's a lot of different sort of applications for this. I think Nobleman of Crossout is a pretty good inclusion in the main deck here. People have been going back and forth on whether to keep it in the main deck or cut it. But I do think that in a deck like this, you probably do want it in the main deck, especially if you're going to be having 2k beaters here. The Nobleman can allow you to get even more aggressive. There's also a Terraforming here to fetch out the Necro Valley. I do think that the ratio of 2 Necro Valley to 1 Terraforming is probably right, as, you don't super, super want the Necro Valleys. Like, you do, but, like, you don't need 3 of them, because then that gets into brick territory. And then for the traps, pretty standard trap lineup here, except for the 2 Solemn Judgment, which I think is a very good inclusion in this deck and can allow you to push for damage, it can allow you to insulate your plays a little bit more, and it's just very, very good card here. And with people not really playing things like Cannon Soldier, this becomes a lot less risky than it has been in past formats. For the side deck, I do think that most of the side deck is pretty straightforward, but Alfia2 also said in the post-game sort of chat that we had after the stream yesterday that the side deck is kind of a jumbled mess of just a bunch of things that, they were potentially thinking of here. One thing to note is Change of Heart is in the side deck here, which is kind of interesting. Change of Heart is a very powerful main deck card, but in a lot of past tournament decks, people actually haven't been maining it, which is kind of neat. I don't necessarily think that that's correct or not. But it has served people well in the past. So seems like maybe that's something that will keep happening in the future. So interesting to see. But yeah, very interesting deck here, and I'm excited for what it means for the format, because I think it means that people will be experimenting with the deck a lot more in the future, and also it means that this format is far from solved. There are still a lot of interesting things to experiment with, and I feel like that will be sort of the defining feature of this format going forward from here on. I feel like, we talked about this on the stream last night, but, we're sort of in that period of like GOAT history where, after GOAT had been first sort of like rediscovered and reinvigorated, there was GOAT Control as sort of like the top tier deck. But then there was a period of experimentation where people realized that, the deck that people thought was maybe the undisputed best deck in the format wasn't necessarily. And so there was a lot of experimentation that happened and sort of developed the modern GOAT metagame as we know it today. And maybe Yata's going through a similar period, and maybe sort of this will be the period where decks start to crystallize as being the best decks in the format. Only time will tell, and I hope that this video has sort of inspired people to get out there and try to experiment for themselves, because I think there's a lot of cool things you can do in this format, and I think that there's a lot of room for this thing to grow. But what do you think? Do you think that, this top was a fluke and that hand control is still the best deck in the format by far? Or do you think that Gravekeepers is actually a tier 1 deck, as this result may imply? And that, with more experimentation, it can become even more dominating. Let me know down in the comments below. And also, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe and leave a like. It really does help out this channel a lot. And we're well on the way to 1,000 subscribers. It would be really cool to hit by the end of the year. So definitely subscribe if you're not already. But until next time, I've been Ben from YG from Zero, and I'm signing off.